Why did the desert go quiet the moment she stepped onto the firing line? No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The pause, the hesitation, that subtle discomfort when someone doesn't perform for approval. She stood there with the rifle resting against her shoulder, unmoving, eyes forward, breath steady. The kind of stillness that wasn't drilled into her, it had been earned. Around her, men shifted their weight, cleared throats, adjusted gear they didn't need to touch. The master gunnery sergeant's voice cut through the air, sharp and dismissive, meant to land like a slap. He joked loudly about her grip, about her stance, about how putting a rifle in her hands was a liability. A few nervous laughs followed, not agreement, relief, relief that the attention wasn't on them. She didn't react, not because she was used to disrespect, but because she'd learned long ago that dignity didn't argue. It waited. Her name was Lennox Thorne, 28, staff sergeant. 3 thin scars on her forearm she never covered even when regulations allowed it. Each one held a memory she carried like weight in her bones. She could feel the skepticism behind her pressing against her spine like heat, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She stood in worse rooms. Louder rooms. Places where doubt arrived dressed as gunfire. What no one on that range knew, not the junior Marines, not the instructors, not even the man trying to humiliate her, was that 4 senior Navy officers were watching from a black Suburban parked just far enough away to be ignored. They weren't there by accident, and they weren't there to intervene. Not yet. She adjusted her position, muscle memory guiding her body into alignment. The rifle wasn't just equipment, it was language, one she spoke fluently. As the range officer called the line ready, she felt her pulse slow. Everything narrowed, the noise faded, and somewhere beneath the discipline, beneath the silence she'd perfected, something stirred. Because 6 months earlier, she'd made a promise over a dead man's body, and promises like that don't fade quietly. She exhaled, and somewhere deep inside her, a question echoed not for them but for herself. Was she ready to let the truth surface? Why did the memory always return when things went quiet? It was never loud, never cinematic, just fragments, snow crunching under boots, cold air burning her lungs, the smell of oil and metal from her father's workshop. Fossil, Oregon, population barely enough to notice when someone left or didn't come back. Her father taught her to shoot before he taught her to drive, not because he wanted a warrior, because he believed discipline started with accountability. Every action mattered. Every mistake stayed with you. She learned that lesson the hard way at 14. One rushed shot, one missed deer, and an hour sitting in silence staring at the empty space where the animal had been. No yelling, no punishment, just consequence. You live with what you do, her father had said. You don't get to rush life. She never rushed again. The Corps came later, recon after that, then selection into places she wasn't supposed to exist on paper, joint task forces, missions without flags, operations that vanished into classified silence. She didn't talk about them, not because she couldn't, because there was no language for what it felt like to watch a helicopter fall out of the sky knowing help was too far away. Helmand Province changed everything. Overwatch, simple, until it was, until the bird went down, until the radio crackled with panic and math stopped working. 20 minutes for help, 5 minutes for the enemy. She and Brooks didn't retreat. They ran toward the crash, toward screaming metal and burning fuel, toward 2 men who didn't know their names but trusted that someone was coming. She shot that day like time had slowed out of respect. 14 rounds. 14 lives ended so 2 could continue. She didn't count during it. Counting came later. What she remembered was Brooks breathing. Wet. Broken. The feel of blood slipping through her fingers as she tried to stop what couldn't be stopped. 90 seconds can feel like an eternity when you're begging the universe to bend. It didn't. She carved the scars that night. Not from guilt. From resolve. 1 for Brooks. 2 for the men she dragged through a minefield when her body had nothing left to give. A reminder that every shot had a cost. And then just like that the war ended. Or at least the paperwork said it did. She was reassigned. silenced, parked in a training command with orders to wait, to disappear. So she did, until someone decided she needed to be reminded of her place. What happens when someone mistakes silence for weakness? Vance Cutler believed in standards, and that belief was sincere. He'd bled for them. He'd earned his reputation the hard way. But somewhere along the line, standards became shields, excuses to protect old assumptions from new realities. When Lennox Thorne showed up on his range, quiet and compliant, he assumed she was temporary. A mistake. Something that would correct itself if pressured long enough. He didn't yell at first. He reassigned, isolated, tested her patience with tedium, waited for frustration to crack her discipline. It never did. She showed up early, stayed late, did everything right, too right, and that unsettled him more than failure ever could. When rumors surfaced that she could shoot, really shoot, he arranged the demonstration not to measure skill but to restore balance, to remind everyone who belonged where. He thought pressure would break her. He didn't understand that pressure was where she'd learned to breathe. The first shot landed clean, the second tighter. By the third, the range wasn't breathing anymore. No whispers, no movement, just disbelief. Each impact erased a little more certainty from the man watching through binoculars. And when the final round tore through the exact center of the target, something irreversible shifted. Still he pushed, moved the goalposts, issued a challenge meant to exhaust, not evaluate. A 72-hour indoctrination designed to strip candidates down to instinct and pain. She accepted without hesitation. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because she'd already been tested in places this couldn't touch. Why does exhaustion reveal more than strength ever could? By mile 10, the desert was unforgiving. Heat pressed down like judgment, packs cut into shoulders, sweat blurred vision. One by one, candidates fell back, not weak, just human. Lennox felt every ache, every blister. Her body protested loudly, but her mind stayed quiet. Navigation came easily. Terrain spoke to her. Angles, shadows, wind. She read the land the way some people read faces. Each task completed not with flair but precision. No wasted motion, no excess pride. By the final night, Cutler's frustration had sharpened into something personal. He told her leadership wasn't about individual performance. That belonging wasn't earned through skill alone. She heard what he didn't say, and she carried it without flinching. The stalk was the final judgment, 800 meters of exposure, instructors watching for the smallest mistake. She moved like memory, slow, deliberate, invisible. Hours passed. Dawn crept in. When the shots rang out and no one could find her, disbelief turned into fear. She stood when he turned away. 8 feet. That was how close he'd come to overlooking her entirely. What does accountability look like when truth finally arrives? The Suburban rolled in quietly. No drama, just presence. Introductions were formal. Facts were delivered without emotion. Her record, her actions, her value, no exaggeration, no defense. Cutler didn't argue. There was nothing left to stand on. Consequences followed, not with spectacle but with precision. A reassignment, a quiet removal, standards preserved by correcting the misuse of them. When offered a return to the shadows of special operations, Lennox declined. She stayed. Because promises don't always pull you forward. Sometimes they anchor you exactly where you are. What does redemption sound like when no one is watching? Weeks later, she stood in front of a new class, 14 candidates, 2 women. She trained them hard, fair, honest. She taught them that shooting wasn't dominance, it was responsibility, that ego missed more targets than wind ever could. When a former skeptic passed his final test, she didn't celebrate. She nodded. That was enough. That night alone, she traced the scars again, wondered if Brooks would understand this version of her life. Teaching, staying, choosing quiet impact over visible glory. Outside, the desert wind moved through the darkness. And somewhere between memory and purpose, she found peace. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the quiet always feel heavier than the noise? She learned that silence wasn't empty. It was crowded. Crowded with things you didn't say because saying them wouldn't change what had already happened. Lennox Thorne felt that silence now, stretched thin across the firing line like a held breath. The desert didn't move. The wind barely touched the flags downrange. Even the men behind her seemed to sense that something was unfolding they didn't yet understand. She adjusted her grip by instinct, not because it needed correcting, but because her hands remembered when no one was watching. The weight of the rifle settled into her shoulder the same way it always had, familiar and grounding, like a truth that didn't care who doubted it. Her heartbeat slowed, each pulse deliberate, measured. She wasn't thinking about the man who had mocked her moments earlier. She wasn't thinking about the eyes on her back, or the quiet challenge hanging in the air. She was thinking about a ridgeline half a world away. The mind does strange things under pressure. It doesn't replay what you want, it replays what shaped you. For Lennox, it was always the same entry point. Cold air, thin light, the sense that the world was balanced on the edge of something fragile. Helmand Province had taught her that calm didn't mean safety, it meant readiness. Back then she'd been lying prone beside Brooks, the earth pressed into her ribs, the smell of dust and metal mixing with something darker. They'd spoken little. They never needed to. Brooks had been the kind of man who trusted preparation more than luck. He taught her how to wait without wasting energy, how to listen to terrain, how to let time work for you instead of against you. The radio crackle had shattered that calm. She remembered the tone before the words, urgency wrapped in disbelief. The helicopter wasn't supposed to go down. Plans weren't supposed to unravel that fast. When it did, everything compressed. Distance, options, time, 5 minutes for the enemy, 20 for help. Numbers like that don't feel real until you realize you're standing between them. They hadn't discussed it. They moved. Training took over where fear would have lived, running toward the smoke, toward the sound of impact, toward men who would never know how close they came to dying alone. She remembered the way the terrain shifted under her boots, loose rocks sliding, the way her lungs burned as if protesting the choice she'd already made. The first shot that day had felt like every other, clean, controlled, necessary. It was the eighth that made her hands shake, not from recoil but from understanding. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't theory. Every decision now had a name attached to it. Someone lived, someone didn't. She never told anyone how Brooks had looked at her before the burst hit him. Not heroic, not dramatic, just focused, doing his job until the job took everything back. When he went down, time warped. 90 seconds stretched into something cruel and elastic. She could still feel the heat of his blood, the way it pulsed against her palms like it was trying to escape reality itself. She begged without words, pressed, adjusted, knew even as she worked that the math wasn't changing. When his grip loosened, something inside her broke cleanly like glass under pressure. No sound, no explosion, just fracture. Those memories never announced themselves. They arrived quietly, and they stayed. A voice over the loudspeaker pulled her back. "Shooter ready." She blinked once. That was all she allowed herself. No deep breath, no ritual, just alignment, the way Brooks had taught her, bone to ground, rifle to body, mind to task. Behind her, Cutler shifted his weight. He didn't know why his jaw was tight. He told himself it was annoyance. It was. It was uncertainty. The kind that crept in when someone didn't react the way you expected them to, when confidence wasn't loud, when defiance didn't look like rebellion. She took the shot. The recoil nudged her shoulder gently, like punctuation. She stayed on the scope, watched the paper jump. Somewhere downrange, a ring was cut clean. She cycled the bolt without thinking, muscle memory older than most of the men watching her. The brass arced away, catching light for a brief second before disappearing into the dust. She didn't rush the next round. She felt the wind on her cheek, subtle but insistent, adjusted, waited. The second shot landed tighter. That was when the silence behind her changed. It wasn't skepticism anymore. It was recalibration. Men were good at that, even if they didn't like admitting it. The body recognizes truth before the mind catches up. Her thoughts drifted again, uninvited. The medical tent, the smell of antiseptic and sweat, the way the corpsman had told her to sit still while he stitched the wire cut on her arm, how she'd nodded, waited, then taken the scalpel when he turned away. 3 lines, clean, controlled, not punishment, memory. She promised herself she wouldn't forget. Not the cost, not the responsibility, not the weight behind every squeeze of the trigger. Another shot. Another impact. Cutler lowered his binoculars for a moment, rubbed his eyes, then lifted them again as if the target might change if he looked away long enough. It didn't. Each hole was exactly where it shouldn't have been if his assumptions were correct. She fired again. By the 5th shot, even the range itself seemed to hold still. No radios crackled, no boots shifted. The desert watched. When the final round punched through the center of the black, erasing the evidence of the last hit, something fragile inside Cutler gave way. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to fear, the realization that he had misjudged the situation so completely that recovery wasn't going to be clean. The call came over the loudspeaker, perfect score, expert. She cleared her weapon the same way she always did, methodical, safe, respectful. Then she stood, brushed the dust from her knees, and waited. She didn't look pleased. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired, not from the shooting, from carrying a truth no one had bothered to ask about. Cutler approached her, words already forming, excuses dressed as standards. He talked about real-world conditions, about pressure, about how paper didn't shoot back. He offered her an out disguised as mercy. Decline the next test. Walk away. Let this end quietly. She listened, truly listened. That was something Brooks had taught her too. Let people reveal themselves fully before you decide who they are. "I'll be ready," she said. Not defiant, not challenging, just factual. As the indoctrination was announced, as rucks were packed and candidates lined up, Lennox felt something unexpected stir beneath the fatigue and the old grief. Not pride, not anger, purpose. A calm acceptance that this wasn't about proving she belonged. It was about whether she would keep honoring the promise she'd made, when everything else had burned away. She adjusted the straps on her pack, feeling the weight settle into familiar places, and stepped forward without looking back. Because some battles don't start with gunfire. They start when someone decides you're smaller than you are, and you choose not to correct them with words. Why did the march feel harder once no one was laughing anymore? The moment the first candidate fell back, the mood shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No one made a show of it, a hand raised, a quiet word to an instructor, then a slow walk to the side of the trail, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the ground. The formation kept moving. That was the rule. Sympathy was silent. Weakness was private. Lennox felt the absence like a missing note in a familiar rhythm. The ruck dug into her shoulders as the sun climbed higher, heat pressing down with the steady cruelty of something that didn't care who you were or what you'd already survived. 60 pounds wasn't new to her. She'd carried more farther under worse conditions. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Pain still registered. It just didn't get a vote. Her boots found their cadence on instinct, soles striking dirt and gravel in a rhythm that kept her breathing steady. 6 steps in, 6 steps out. She focused on small things, the sound of fabric shifting with each movement, the faint clink of metal somewhere in a pack ahead of her, the way sweat traced paths down her spine and soaked into the waistband of her trousers. Attention narrowed to what mattered now. Forward, stable, controlled. Cutler set the pace from the front, long strides, no breaks. He wasn't running them into the ground out of cruelty, at least not consciously. He believed stress revealed truth. That exhaustion stripped away pretense. What he didn't realize was that Lennox had already been stripped bare once before, and there was nothing left for this to take. By mile 5, breathing around her grew ragged. One candidate stumbled on loose shale, caught himself, kept going. Another swore under his breath, the word cracking with effort. Lennox didn't look around. She kept her eyes on the terrain ahead, scanning for footing, reading slope and shadow the way she always had. Pain lived in her shoulders now, a deep, persistent ache that radiated down her arms. She acknowledged it, cataloged it, moved on. This wasn't suffering, this was work. At mile 8, the heat began to do what it always did. It separated discipline from desire. Faces flushed, steps shortened. Packs shifted as straps loosened under sweat. Someone gagged, bent slightly, recovered. Cutler didn't slow. He watched from the corner of his eye, measuring collapse against expectation. Lennox felt the first hot spot forming on her heel and adjusted her stride almost imperceptibly. Small corrections prevented big problems. Brooks' voice surfaced in her mind, calm and precise. Fix it early. Don't wait for it to break. By mile 10, the trail opened into a scrub-filled basin, the air shimmering. Cutler raised a fist and the formation halted. 12 candidates stood spaced out along the path, chests heaving, eyes squinting against the sun. Sweat darkened uniforms. Dust clung to skin like a second layer. Navigation problem, Cutler announced. Solo movement, 2 kilometers. Map and compass only. Establish a hide. Engage targets at unknown distances. 90 minutes. Somewhere behind Lennox, someone exhaled sharply. This wasn't just endurance anymore. This was thinking under fatigue. The kind of thinking that failed quietly and left you lost. She took the map, unfolded it with care, shielding it from the breeze. Her eyes moved quickly, tracing contour lines, identifying terrain features. She didn't rush. Rushing cost time later. She oriented the map, checked the compass, confirmed her azimuth. The land told a story if you listened to it, ridgelines, draws, choke points. She picked her route, not the shortest, but the cleanest. When she stepped off, she felt Cutler's eyes on her back. Not dismissive now, appraising. He was trying to see the flaw, the hesitation, something he could point to later and say, there, that's where she came up short. She moved efficiently, using terrain to mask her silhouette, adjusting pace to maintain awareness. Loose shale slowed her, but she compensated, angling slightly to firmer ground. Her thighs burned on the climbs, lungs protesting in dry gasps, but her mind stayed sharp. She checked her bearing against the sun, corrected a slight drift, pressed on. 42 minutes later, she reached the checkpoint. She allowed herself one sip of water, not because she was desperate, because dehydration punished arrogance later. She found a shallow depression overlooking the target array, scraped out just enough earth to settle in, then went still. The rifle came up smoothly. The scope filled her vision. She ranged the targets carefully, not by guesswork, by measurement. Mil dots lined up, numbers clicked into place. 420, 560, 680. She dialed elevation, adjusted for wind, and fired. 3 shots, 3 impacts. She didn't smile. When Cutler arrived, breath controlled but heavier than before, he checked her targets through the spotting scope. He didn't comment, just marked the card. Silence again, but this one felt different, less dismissive, more unsettled. As the hours stacked, exhaustion seeped into everything. Muscles cramped, tempers shortened, mistakes crept in around the edges. Lennox felt the fatigue too. By hour 30, sleep deprivation dulled the world, colors flattening, sounds stretching. She countered it the way she always had, routines, checks, small anchors of order in a drifting mind. She noticed things others missed. A boot print out of place, a glint of glass on a ridgeline, the way birds reacted to movement long before human eyes caught it. Observation wasn't talent. It was attention, practiced until it became instinct. Cutler watched her through all of it. He told himself he was evaluating performance. What he was really doing was reconciling belief with evidence, and evidence was winning. By hour 60, resentment had hardened into something quieter. He pulled her aside during a brief rest window, spoke in low tones about leadership, about trust, about fitting into a team. He never said she didn't belong. She heard it anyway. She met his eyes without challenge, without apology. She didn't argue, she didn't defend herself. She simply listened, absorbing the words without letting them define her. Belonging, she knew, wasn't granted by approval. It was earned through consistency. The final event came before dawn. The stalk. 800 meters of open ground. Instructors watching, binoculars sweeping. Any mistake meant failure. Lennox lay flat at the start point, chest pressed into cold dirt, the world just beginning to lighten at the edges. She slowed her breathing until it matched the rhythm of the land. Wind brushed the grass gently. Shadows were long and forgiving if you knew how to use them. She moved inches at a time. Pain faded into background noise. Elbows burned, knees ached. Her uniform snagged once, fabric tearing softly. She froze, waited, let the moment pass. No one saw, she continued. Time lost meaning. There was only movement and stillness, alternating in careful balance. When she reached the final position, she settled in, heart rate steady, mind clear. She ranged, adjusted, fired. 2 shots. 2 hits. The radio chatter that followed was confused. Reports came in, shots registered, no shooter located. Cutler's voice cut through, sharp, disbelieving. Search the area. Instructors moved methodically, eyes scanning, boots crunching closer. Lennox stayed perfectly still. She could hear them now, smell them, feel the vibration of footsteps through the ground. Cutler himself approached, binoculars sweeping, stopping 8 feet from her position. She could see his boots, the dust on them, the way his stance shifted as he searched. He didn't see her. When he turned away, she rose smoothly, shedding the camouflage she'd built from the land itself. She stepped out of concealment like a thought made real. Cutler spun. The color drained from his face. And in that moment, that suspended, silent moment, something inside Lennox loosened. Not triumph, not vindication, release. The quiet understanding that she no longer needed to carry this alone. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently, until there's nowhere left to hide from it. Why did the ground feel unsteady the moment she stood up? For a brief second, no one spoke. The desert seemed to hold its breath, as if even the wind didn't want to interrupt what had just been revealed. Lennox stood where she had been invisible only moments before, camouflage netting sliding from her shoulders, dust clinging to her sleeves. Her muscles trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden release of hours of absolute control. When you move that slowly for that long, the body forgets how to exist any other way. Cutler stared at her as though she'd stepped out of a memory he didn't know he had. 8 feet. That was the distance. 8 feet he'd walked past her without seeing a thing. 8 feet between certainty and doubt. He lowered the binoculars slowly, his grip loosening as if the weight of them had changed. Where the hell, he started, then stopped. There was nothing left to say. The instructors looked between them, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. They were trained to observe, to report, to correct, but this wasn't a mistake to be corrected. This was a reckoning unfolding in real time. Lennox met Cutler's eyes briefly, then looked past him, scanning the horizon out of habit more than need. The mission was over. The work, however, was not. Her joints ached as the adrenaline ebbed, fatigue crashing in like a delayed wave. 72 hours without real sleep left the edges of the world soft and unreal. Still, her posture remained steady. She didn't slump. She didn't stretch. Discipline didn't disappear just because the evaluation had ended. That was when the sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness. A low, deliberate crunch, unhurried, the kind of arrival that didn't need announcement. Heads turned toward the access road where a black Suburban rolled into view, sunlight flashing briefly off its windshield. It came to a stop near the instructor's position, engine idling, presence unmistakable. Lennox felt it before she fully understood it. A shift in the air, not threat, not relief, recognition. 4 doors opened. 4 officers stepped out, uniforms crisp, movements economical, senior, confident in a way that came from years of being exactly where they were supposed to be. Cutler straightened reflexively, confusion flickering across his face as he recognized the ranks. Navy, high enough that questions came later. The man who approached first extended his hand with calm professionalism, introduced himself by name and position. His voice was even, unhurried, but there was weight behind every word. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. Cutler shook the offered hand automatically, his mind scrambling to catch up. He asked what this was about. The answer came not as accusation, but as fact. They knew who she was. They spoke her name with familiarity, not ceremony. They spoke of places Cutler had only read about in redacted reports, of actions that had been reduced to sanitized lines in official citations. 14 enemies, 18 minutes, 2 men carried out alive when the numbers said they shouldn't have been. As the words settled, Lennox felt something tighten in her chest. Not pride, not shame, exposure. She had spent months being smaller on purpose, folding herself into the background because it was easier than explaining, easier than watching people decide what they felt about her before she ever opened her mouth. She hadn't asked for this moment, but she didn't run from it either. Cutler's face had gone still, the way it did when someone was processing something they couldn't argue with. Standards, authority, judgment. All the things he believed in were suddenly pointing in a direction he hadn't anticipated. One of the officers spoke next, his tone careful, controlled. He explained that concerns had been raised, that what had begun as an evaluation had crossed into something else. Public humiliation wasn't discipline. It was a misuse of power, and misuse, regardless of intent, demanded review. The word investigation landed without drama. It didn't need emphasis. Everyone there understood what it meant. Cutler opened his mouth, then closed it. There were defenses he could have offered, context, intent, belief. None of them mattered anymore, not because he was being punished, but because the situation had outgrown him. When the officers turned to Lennox, their expression softened. Not pity, respect. One of them asked a simple question: was she ready to come back? Come back, 2 words that carried 1,000 implications. Return to the places where silence meant survival, where decisions were measured in seconds and mistakes in lives, where her skills would be used, not tested. She looked at Cutler, at the instructors, at the candidates watching from a distance, trying to understand how the ground beneath their assumptions had shifted so quickly. "I have work here," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but inside something complicated moved. Loyalty, purpose, promise. She thought of Brooks again, not how he died, but how he lived. How he'd believed that teaching was just another form of service, that the mission didn't always look the way you expected. The officer nodded, accepting the answer without pressure. He told her the door would remain open. It always had been. They left as quietly as they'd arrived. The Suburban rolled away, taking with it the finality of the moment. Dust settled. Sound returned. Cutler stood alone, the weight of everything pressing down at once. No shouting, no scene, just consequence. 2 weeks later, the changes were official, quietly handled. A reassignment that looked lateral on paper but removed him from influence. No public disgrace, no ceremony, just absence. Lennox was promoted not long after. The paperwork came with little fanfare. She accepted it the same way she accepted everything else, with calm acknowledgement. Titles didn't change who she was. Responsibility did. On her first day running the program, she stood before 14 candidates, 2 women, 12 men, faces tight with nerves and ambition. She didn't soften the standards. She didn't apologize for them either. She trained them the way Brooks had trained her, with precision, with honesty, with the understanding that every skill learned here would one day matter when no one was watching. When one of the younger Marines struggled, she corrected him without judgment. When he succeeded, she didn't praise him loudly. She simply nodded. That nod meant more than words. That night, alone in her quarters, Lennox sat on the edge of her rack, exhaustion finally catching up. She traced the scars on her forearm slowly, deliberately. 1, 2, 3. She didn't know if she'd chosen the easier path or the harder one. But she knew it was the right one. Because strength didn't need an audience. And sometimes, the most important battles ended not with victory, but with clarity. Why did the silence after success feel heavier than the struggle itself? The range was empty now, stripped of voices and expectation, the desert settling back into itself as if nothing had happened. Lennox stood alone near the firing line long after the others had gone, the sky fading from hard blue to something softer, almost forgiving. She hadn't planned to stay. She just hadn't felt ready to leave. After moments like this, movement felt wrong, as if stepping away too quickly might undo something fragile she'd only just put back in place. Promotion came with paperwork, not celebration. A quiet handshake, a new line on a duty roster, a subtle shift in how people addressed her. Gunny, they said now, testing the word, adjusting to the idea. She acknowledged it with a nod and nothing more. Rank didn't erase memory. It didn't ease the weight that still lived in her shoulders or the ache that flared in her forearm when the nights got cold. Her first class assembled before dawn. 14 candidates stood in formation, boots aligned, eyes forward. 2 women among them, both younger than Lennox had been when she'd first stepped into a world that didn't expect her to last. She saw herself in the way they held their shoulders too tight, in the careful neutrality of their expressions. Not fear, calculation, the awareness that every movement would be measured. She didn't begin with a speech. She never did. Words were cheap at the start. Instead, she handed out rucks, assigned weights, and pointed toward the trail disappearing into the low hills. Standards were introduced through action, always had been. The days that followed were hard in ways that didn't photograph well. No dramatic collapses, no shouting for effect, just repetition, fatigue, corrections given quietly and often. Lennox watched closely, not for who was strongest, but for who paid attention when things stopped going their way. One candidate, a young lance corporal with quick hands and quicker opinions, struggled early. Not physically, mentally. He rushed shots, second-guessed himself, let frustration leak into his posture. She corrected him without raising her voice, made him repeat drills until his impatience gave way to focus. He didn't like her at first. She knew that. Discomfort has a way of disguising itself as resentment. Late one afternoon, after a long navigation exercise, he approached her while the others rehydrated. He didn't stand at parade rest. He didn't look away either. "Gunny," he said, hesitating, "why didn't you take the offer?" She knew what he meant. Everyone did. Rumors traveled faster than official memos. She considered the question for a moment, watching heat shimmer over the dirt. "Because not everything that matters moves you forward," she said finally. "Some things ask you to stay." He nodded, though she could tell he didn't fully understand yet. Understanding took time. Pain helped. As the course progressed, something shifted. The candidates stopped looking at her as an obstacle and started looking at her as a reference point. Not because she demanded it, because consistency is persuasive. She enforced standards evenly, praised sparingly, corrected immediately. No favorites, no exceptions. When one of the women faltered during a stalk, frustration edging toward panic, Lennox crouched beside her and spoke softly. Not encouragement, guidance. Small adjustments, breathe, slow, trust the process. The candidate passed on her second attempt, tears mixing with dust as she exhaled in disbelief. That night, Lennox lay awake longer than she wanted to admit, staring at the ceiling of her quarters as memories threaded themselves through the quiet. Brooks again. Always Brooks. She wondered what he'd think of this version of her life. Of teaching instead of operating. of staying where she was known instead of returning to places where anonymity was survival. She imagined his answer without needing to hear it. He would have reminded her that survival wasn't the point, purpose was. On the final day, the last stalk concluded just after sunrise. The lance corporal who'd struggled early emerged from concealment looking stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe he'd done it. His shots had landed true. His hide had held. He'd trusted himself when it mattered. Lennox walked out to his position once the evaluation was complete. He waited, silent, shoulders tight. "You did solid work," she said, "nothing more." Relief washed over his face, sharp and unguarded. "Thank you, Gunny." She handed him his scorecard and turned away. Validation wasn't something she lingered on. It was a tool, not a reward. That evening, after the range cleared and the last reports were filed, Lennox returned to her quarters. She sat on the edge of her rack, boots still on, hands resting on her knees. Fatigue pressed in, deep and honest, the kind that comes from effort without spectacle. She rolled up her sleeve and traced the scars again. 3 lines, parallel, deliberate, one for a man who taught her how to breathe when everything fell apart, 2 for lives that continued because she didn't miss. She no longer needed them as reminders. Not really. The lesson had settled deeper than skin, precision over pride, responsibility over recognition. Outside, the desert wind rattled the window gently, a familiar sound. She turned off the light and lay back, letting the darkness take over. Tomorrow she would do it again. Not because anyone was watching, but because somewhere, someday, one of these Marines would be lying in the dirt with a rifle and a choice. And when that moment came, she wanted them ready. Why did peace arrive only after the lights went out? Sleep didn't come easily that night. It never did after a course ended. The body was exhausted, hollowed out in the best way, but the mind lingered, walking slow circles around moments that refused to stay put. Lennox lay on her rack, hands folded over her stomach, listening to the desert wind brush against the window like a question it wasn't asking loudly enough. She thought about how strange it was that silence could feel earned. When she was younger, silence had felt like exclusion, like being overlooked at briefing tables, like watching eyes slide past her toward louder voices, broader shoulders. Back then, quiet meant invisible, something you fought against. Now it meant something else entirely. It meant nothing was chasing her. Morning came without ceremony. Pale light, cool air, the base waking in fragments, engines turning over, distant boots on concrete, radios crackling with routine. Lennox moved through it all with practiced ease, the same way she always had. Coffee, gear check, notes from the previous course filed away not as statistics but as people, strengths, weaknesses, patterns. She believed patterns mattered more than scores. Weeks passed, then months. Her program gained a reputation not for brutality but for honesty. Marines didn't fear it, they respected it. The ones who passed knew exactly why they had. The ones who didn't understood where they'd fallen short. No mystery, no bitterness, just clarity. That was intentional. Every now and then someone would ask about her past, usually quietly, usually when they thought no one else could hear. She never lied. But she never told the whole story either, not because it was secret, but because it wasn't the point. What matters, she'd say, is whether you're ready when it's your turn. One afternoon, she stood at the edge of the range watching a new class zero their rifles. The sun was high, the air sharp with heat and metal. A young Marine struggled with his breathing, shots drifting wide. She watched for a moment, then stepped in, adjusting his position by inches. "Don't fight the rifle," she said calmly. "Let it rest where it wants to." He nodded, tried again. The next round landed clean. She stepped back, letting the moment belong to him. That was how it worked now. She didn't need credit. She didn't need acknowledgement. Watching someone get it right was enough. Knowing that somewhere down the line that correction might save a life, that was the reward. Sometimes late at night she still dreamed of Helmand. Not the firefight, not the kills, Brooks, always Brooks, standing beside her, checking wind, murmuring numbers under his breath. In the dreams he never died, he just watched, quiet, approving. When she woke, the grief was softer now, rounded at the edges, it no longer cut, it reminded. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the range emptied, Lennox stayed behind again. She liked the way the world felt when everyone else left. Honest, undemanding. She sat on a crate, rifle resting across her knees, and looked out over the distant targets. She thought about the man she'd once been told she wasn't good enough to impress, about how his career had unraveled not because of malice, but because certainty had hardened into blindness. She didn't feel triumph about it, only sadness, a quiet understanding that standards, when used without humility, became weapons too. She hoped he learned something. More than that, she hoped she never did. The scars on her arm had faded slightly over time, edges softening, lines less angry. They were still there. They always would be. But they no longer felt like wounds. They felt like chapters. As the last light slipped behind the hills, Lennox stood, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and walked toward the barracks. Her steps were unhurried, grounded. She belonged to this rhythm now, teaching, guiding, holding the line in a different way. Somewhere in the distance, a new class would arrive. New doubts, new assumptions, new chances to get it right. She would be there. Not loud, not imposing, just present. Because strength didn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it showed up early, stayed late, and did the work no one applauded. Sometimes dignity didn't raise its voice. It simply acted.